It is a huge honor to interview Reverend Robert Sirico today. Father Sirico literally inspired us to establish our own think tank, Instituto Fe y Libertad, because of the outstanding work he and his team have done at Acton Institute. Father Sirico is President Emeritus and co-founder of the Acton Institute, and in that capacity, he has lectured at colleges, universities, and business organizations throughout the U.S. and abroad. His writings on religious, political, economic, and social matters are published in the variety of journals, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and he is frequently asked to comment on current events by top media outlets such as CNN, ABC, BBC, NPR, and CBS's 60 Minutes, among others. Father Sirico received his Master of Divinity degree from Catholic University of America, following undergraduate study at University of Southern California and the University of London. During his studies and early ministry, he experienced a growing concern over the lack of training religious studies students receive in fundamental economic principles, leaving them poorly equipped to understand and address today's social problems. As a result of these concerns, Father Sirico co-founded the Acton Institute with Chris Morin, who is actually now president, right? And the founding was in 1990. In April of 1999, Father Sirico was awarded an honorary doctorate in Christian ethics from the Franciscan University of Steubenville, and in May of 2001 from Universidad Francisco Marroquín, where he got a doctorate in social studies. He is a member of the prestigious Montpellier Society, of the American Academy of Religion, and the Philadelphia Society, and is on the board of advisors of the Civic Institute in Prague. Father Sirico has also served on the Michigan Civil Rights Commission from 1994 to 98, and his pastoral ministry has included a chaplaincy to AIDS patients at the National Institute of Health. He is pastor emeritus of Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And we should also mention that Father Sirico holds an Italian and American citizenship. So today we're here to discuss his most recent book, The Economics of the Parables, which was published last year and which we are very glad to hear will soon be available in Spanish. So thank you so much, Father Sirico, for granting this interview.
It's great to be back in Guatemala.
Thank you. Well, Brian McLaren, he's a Christian pastor and author. He wrote that Jesus was short on sermons, long on conversations, short on answers, long on questions, short on abstraction and propositions, long on stories and parables, short on telling you what to think, and long on challenging you to think for yourself. I thought that quote was very fitting to preface this discussion about your book and the parables. What do you think about this quote?
Well, it's a nice quote, and it captures a lot of the truth. I think Jesus, though, did teach some very definite things and did teach people what to think and how to live, more importantly. I think what the pastor's trying to do there is to focus on the uniqueness of Jesus in terms of the personal dimensions of his ministry. The way he converted hearts was by developing relationships with people. We see that throughout the Gospels. I think of the woman at the well, who is a great sinner. And she meets him and is intrigued by him. And he says, well, go get your husband. And she said, well, I don't have a husband. And he says, that's right. In fact, you've had 5 husbands. The one you're living with now is not your husband. You've told the truth. I mean, imagine somebody saying that to somebody. And yet he does it in such a way that it even more captivates her heart. And she becomes an evangelist for him. So I think that's true. Jesus was not abstract. He was personal. He was incarnate. He was the God, the abstraction incarnate. The only other way to think about God would be as an abstraction if he did not come in the flesh. And that's a lot of what the parables are. It's a readout of the real life.
Of real life. And so why did you write the book?
Well, In a real sense, I've been writing the book for more than a decade. My work with economic issues through the Acton Institute causes me to think about economic matters. And then my work as a pastor causes me to preach on the Gospels, including the parables. And you don't hermetically seal yourself off one from the other. Very often I would see something in a parable that I would see in a more abstract way in economics, and vice versa. But I didn't want to make the work I did with the Acton Institute into a pulpit, and I certainly didn't want to make the pulpit at Mass into a seminar in economics. So I began drawing the things that I thought connected in my own mind, and did several drafts of it, had several interns do some research on it and some rewriting of it. And then one of the good things that came out of COVID in my life was that I wrote the book. I finished the book. I always knew that all I needed was a month. I got a year. And then the book came out last May.
Last May. And in the introduction, you say that Jesus didn't really intend these stories to be economic lessons.
Yes,
sort of what you just explained happened to you in your two roles.
I guess so.
Yes. But the parables do contain insights about economics.
Yes.
So
That's a very important point too, Carol, because I don't want people to think that in writing this book, I was we say in biblical studies, exegeting and eisegeting. Exegesis is when you pull the meaning out of the text. Eisegeting is when you put your own meaning into the text. I wasn't eisegeting. Mm-hmm. I wasn't saying, oh, because I believe in these things about economics, I find them in Jesus. And the reason for that is that what economics is, in my way of thinking, your way of thinking, is human action. It's human decision-making given the contingencies of real life, which occur in markets and in contracts and in relationships and in disputes and all these kinds of things. So what Jesus, in observing the human reality, can't help but speak about the economic dimensions of that human reality.
yes. When I was reading, I was wondering if you have a favorite parable. Was it hard selecting the parables to write about?
I'm asked that very often, and I finally came up with a good answer. So if you're asking me that question, I'm going to say, Carol, you have 8 children. Do you have a favorite child? Certain children have certain features to you that are, really unique. And I have to say that's with the parables. There is a parable, there are 2 parables, and they're very similar. In fact, people very often confuse them, that moves my heart very deeply. And it's the shortest parable. It's the parable of the pearl of great price. Mm-hmm. And the other parable that goes along with it is the man who finds the treasure in the field. And what I find so intriguing about that parable, the pearl of great price, is to find something you love so much that you're willing to give up everything else, is the very reason of human life. If you go through life and you don't have anything you're worth dying for, then you haven't had anything you're worth living for. And in that short little parable, was it a sentence, 2 sentences? The man finds something that's worth more than everything else he had, and he surrenders everything else. But there's an economic dimension to that too, which isn't the whole purpose of the parable, but it gives substance to the story. So I would have to say that because I found something at a point in my life, and that's my vocation, that meant more to me than everything else I had accumulated.
That's nice. Yes. The rich fool, the talents, and the rich man and Lazarus are three chapters where you analyze parables about people who are very wealthy and people who are very poor. And it, I think they're very useful to reflect on wealth and poverty, and if it's bad for a Christian to be rich, or is wealth or money inherently bad?
That's you hear that very often, especially in religious circles, but also in secular political circles, that somehow the wealthy are decried for their wealth, and it comes as a shock to people that a Catholic priest would be speaking about economics to say that that is not what Jesus is saying. On the other hand, and this is what I think is very important to keep in mind, the stereotype of people who defend the free market and the prosperity that the free market gives, the stereotype of that that is so mistaken is to say that if you have wealth, it's proof that you have God's blessing. And that's not what we're saying at all. Wealth is not an indicator of God's blessing. It is an indicator that you know how to utilize the law of supply and demand, what people need and the production quality. That can be good or bad. You know the seven deadly sins.
Yes.
You know, what's interesting, as I was writing the book, I was thinking about this, repeatedly thinking about the seven deadly sins. Like the rich fool is a good example of this. In the seven deadly sins, it's not sex that's sinful. That's the deadly sin. It's lust. It's not wealth. It's greed. And you go through all of the seven deadly sins. It's not even anger. It's wrath. When you go through the seven deadly sins, the real sin takes place in the heart, not externally. And that's the thing. You look at a wealthy person, and their bank account can't tell you the level of their sanctity. Or the other way. The fact that a person is poor doesn't mean that they're necessarily virtuous. We may have great compassion for a poor person, and we should. We're mandated by the Gospels to do that. But just because a person's poor doesn't mean that they're a saint. You have to look at the person. That's what Jesus does. And he does it in contrasting ways in these parables.
In these parables. I really like the fact that you draw out the vices and that you mention, what's in people's hearts, and if the wealth is well acquired or through hard work. We don't know that. Sometimes
that's the first question. First of all, has the wealth been produced in a just manner? You can have wealth by robbing somebody, or you can have wealth by discovering the use of something that is really incredibly beneficial to the whole of the human community. Maybe it's a medicine that you've discovered. You kind of came upon it inadvertently. Many entrepreneurial discoveries were not intended to be discovered. I think of the Post-it notes.
Right.
Nobody said, we need our notes to be able to post and take off. It was a mistake. It was a mistake in making glue. And then they found, we have this glue that you can take and put on, and it doesn't leave anything there. And I think that's the way we have to analyze the moral life of a business person. So the first question is it produced justly? The second question is, what does the person who has the wealth think of their wealth? Is this the be-all and end-all of their life? Is this the goal of their life? Do they own the wealth, or does the wealth own them? That's the second question. And the third question, and this is usually the first question in everybody's mind, is how much do you give to the poor? That's it. And in a way, that is an important question for the person who has the wealth. But socially speaking, that's not the most important question. Why do I say that? because charity, and this is where people think I'm a heretic, but if you think about it for 2 minutes, you realize it's not. Charity is not the normal way that people get out of poverty. Charity is emergency.
Right.
Somebody needs something, you give it to them in this particular moment. But the normal way people come out of poverty is by having jobs. And that is a whole economic system, an infrastructure, a set of ideas and values that have to be not only built and understood, but I think should be morally praised precisely because it's the mechanism by which the poor rise out of poverty.
The other thing I found really interesting while reading your book is that you draw out how many families are torn apart in Jesus' time and now by wealth, by inheritance issue disputes, and by all of these resentments or jealousies that emerge.
It doesn't even need to be it doesn't even need to be a big estate.
Right,
It can be over a lamp or a brooch. You know?
So it's really tempting to argue that these struggles would not ensue if these possessions were not available to the people. But you point to another interpretation.
Sure. Well, I'm thinking of, which one were you thinking about? I was thinking, as you're telling that story, is the two brothers.
The two brothers.
It was called the prodigal son.
The prodigal son, yes.
Yeah. Which I think, and a lot of commentators say this, is misnamed. You know, that's not the title that's given. The names of the parables are not given by the Gospels. They
evolved.
Tradition, you know, yeah. But really, the real core of the prodigal son story is the merciful father. Because it's interesting to see these two sons, the one who takes the money from the father, takes an advance on his inheritance and goes and squanders it, and the son who stays home has labored all day. And we think this son is the faithful son, this is the good son, and this son is the bad son. But really, both of these sons have a very similar view of the father and their inheritance, their rights to their inheritance. We don't see that at the beginning of the gospel with regard to the second son. We see that at the end of the gospel.
End when
But the father welcomes back the prodigal and then has a big celebration.
Yeah.
And that's when we see the other son. And his resentment to the father comes out because he says, this son of yours who squandered your money on riotous living and with prostitutes, he says. That's the first time the prostitute thing comes up. It's his brother accusing him. He says, and here I am laboring for you day and night, and you haven't even given me a little calf to
eat with my friends.
So his mind was always in this kind of resentful posture. And the father corrects him. And he says, but you were with me always. Everything I have is yours. And the son never appreciated that. And the other son, the prodigal son, of course, spends the money as though it's not his money either, And all the father's interested in doing is reconciling them. And now he invites this son. This is very dramatic, very intriguing, and I think it's not thought about enough. That son who was there is invited to come in just the way the other son was invited to come in. And we're left hanging.
Yes, we don't know if he came in.
We don't know. We'd like to think that he did, like the other one did. But I think that's another part of the genius of these stories is Jesus very often leaves them ambiguous. We get frustrated with them. Sometimes after Mass, people say, well, what about this or that in the gospel? And I say, I don't know. That's why we're talking about them 2,000 years later.
And they're timeless because these same disputes continue and in other families and in our time.
The funny story I heard about the prodigal son, the Sunday school teacher was teaching in class about the prodigal son. And after taught the whole story, she said, boys and girls, now, who can tell me at the end of the story, who was the one figure who was unhappy at the end of this story? And the little girl stood up and she said, the fatted calf. I always thought that was a cute thing. I've used that in my homilies.
That's cute. Well, what can we learn about property rights from the parables?
Well, in any number of the parables, I mean, I probably the clearest statement, if I'm thinking about it. Let me say this first. The whole backdrop is a system where the right to property is recognized and established, and that's shouldn't be a surprise for anyone from a Jewish background. After all, the commandment says, "Thou shalt not steal," right? Mm-hmm. So the whole backdrop assumes property. But where you see it articulated by one of the figures, one of the characters in the parables, is probably in the dispute over the laborers in the vineyards. This is where the ones who work later in the day get paid the same as
those who came later. Mm-hmm.
And the owner of the field has a conversation at the end with the people who are complaining about it. And he says, are you envious because I am generous? Do I not have the right to do with my property what I want? Mm-hmm. It's really quite explicit. Mm-hmm. And of course, the whole point of this message isn't about economics and stuff, although if you look at it from an economic point of view, it really is talking about the subjective value. It's the rejection of the labor theory of value, the rejection of Marx's notion that labor is what gives the price to a product. It's the subjective value of the workers. And those workers who came later in the day were arguably even more important because it was getting urgent to get the whole thing in. And that's kind of the economic dimension. But the lesson, the real spiritual lesson, is to recognize the beauty of generosity and not to demand rights. When we stand before God in the end, in the final judgment, we're not going to demand our rights. We're not going to demand justice. I'm not going to demand justice, because if I get justice, I'm in trouble.
Beg mercy. Yes. And also, we learn a lot about work and entrepreneurship and investment from the parables.
There's so many of them that talk about that. I mean, the whole parable of the servants who are entrusted with these what are called talents. Interestingly enough, the word talent it comes to us in English from this word, which was an economic unit. But now, at least in the English language, I don't know about it.
In Spanish as well, it means abilities or capabilities.
Yes. Same thing in English, but it was in the gospel.
And it was quite a big amount of money.
He was investing quite a bit.
Like hundreds of thousands.
Yes, by day's labor. I've forgotten the exact number right now. So he gives 5 and 2 and 1. There are actually 2 versions of this gospel, so it's easy to become confused with and I chose the one that I thought was clearer and made some of the economic points that I was wanting to make, but I quote both of them, cite both of them in here. And in that, what we see is the whole question of productivity, that the ones who are most productive receive more. Again, this is not an economic point, it's a spiritual point. Are you the most faithful? And the real telling thing about that gospel is the one who
buried his talent.
Yeah, and he doesn't lose it. He gives back what was there. That's another interesting little nuance to that gospel. It's not like he says, "Oh, I lost it." It would have been interesting again to speculate. What if the man had invested it and the investment went bad? I did my best. What would Jesus add? He might have rewarded him more than he rewarded the one who made the 10. But instead, he is quite harshly condemned. And why? What prompts that? What prompts it is the attitude that servant had toward the master. He didn't know the master, yet he accused the master. And in a way, when I read that, I had heard that line of argument many times over the years. He says, "You are a harsh man, gathering where you have not scattered." Who says that about wealthy people who make investments? The Marxists make that argument. They say, what it's saying, I'm going to put it in economic terms, is that wealth is intrinsically evil, that you really don't earn it. You exploit people for it. And that's what he's saying to the master. You gather where you have not scattered. You haven't produced this. And he doesn't know the master. He's saying that he's cruel and hard. And it's for that reason that the master condemns him.
And he's idle.
And he's idle, yeah. And he's fearful.
Fearful.
You know, that's the contrasting emotional reaction in business people. Some people want to be successful. They have a great bunch of ideas, but they're too afraid. The entrepreneur is the person who has a great bunch of ideas and is brave enough to risk sometimes their entire livelihood, their homes. They charge up their credit cards. You've heard all these stories of business people who will invest everything because they're just so sure of their idea. This man exhibits the opposite qualities.
In the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, which we didn't discuss, there's sort of an implication that Lazarus is lying there because of something the rich man did to him, and that there's some resentment there also, and some I don't know, demanding rights.
Yes, and of course
for the beggar.
It's not there at all. There's nothing that says that the man did anything to Lazarus. The best argument you can make is that he just didn't see Lazarus, which is morally culpable. But this is a far richer story that's being told here. St. Augustine, I think it was St. Augustine, one of the saints said that Lazarus was not in hell because he was rich, but because he was proud. And the poor man was not in heaven because he was poor, but because he was humble. And I think when you read it through that lens, you see a lot of different things happening. It's really the story of a reversal of fortunes. A number of the parables do that. They reverse the fortunes of the person. And in this one, it's quite telling because everybody knows the name of wealthy people. Their names are on buildings. They're honored with awards and accolades and everything. The rich man is never named in this gospel. Some of the commentators historically have given him a name, but that's not in the gospel.
Epulon. In Spanish, they call him Epulon, but that sort of means the glutton. It's not really a name. It's just an adjective to describe his behavior.
He's called Dives in English. But Lazarus is named, which is, by the way, rare in parables, that you have the name of the person. And even when they're in eternity, when they're at their final judgment, the rich man is still giving orders to Lazarus. Well, send him to put a drop of water on my mouth, or send him to my brothers and tell them what they need to do to avoid this. He's giving orders, still ordering Lazarus around. And so you have this whole kind of reversal in the life. And it's too simplistic to just say this is a story about the evils of wealth.
This ties in well with another question I had about equality, because we're so concerned about equality nowadays, and people want sort of equal results, and they feel that we should somehow erase all kinds of differences, including different talents among people and different income levels. And And what you read from the parables is that's not reality. That's not how life works.
And that the dignity of the person is not contingent upon their material success. And that's the thing that's equal. It's the dignity of the person. And the talents that they're given, the responsibilities with which they are entrusted, are all diverse. And the call for equity now has not been generally a moral call. It's been a political call. And of course, the minute that happens, then you have injustices being committed on the other side. No two people can really be equal in a serious way simply because we're all unique. We're all unrepeatable. The concern of Jesus throughout the Gospels, certainly in the parables, but throughout the Gospels, is not the gap between the rich and the poor, but the floor. How are the poor being treated? That's the concern of our Lord, not the gap, not even the ceiling. In a sense, the end of this book, I have an afterword, which is probably a fourth of the book. And I go through a lot of the other economic situations in the New Testament. And there you see these kinds of things being played out with the call of the rich man, the rich young ruler he's called, and I think it's Luke's gospel. And everybody always points to that as, see, Jesus tells him to get rid of his money. That's just kind of the way in which it's dismissed, but it's far more intriguing than just that. Jesus looks at him and loves him, and the first thing he says to him is not, get rid of your money. He says, go and sell what you have. He commands him to engage in trade and commerce. It's interesting. Sell what you have and give to the poor. It doesn't even say give everything to the poor. Maybe meant everything, maybe didn't. But the point is that there's some connection between what he gives to the poor and the money he gets from the sale. So he's going to be intent on making sure that he makes some money on that sale in order to give to the poor.
In order to be able to give.
So that's the first thing there. The second thing is the whole summation of that gospel, because the apostles are curious about what all this means. And Jesus says, and this is the line that you hear very often kind of thrown against people who believe in a free and prosperous economy, that it is difficult for the rich to get into heaven, that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into the kingdom of heaven. And the apostles are dumbstruck by this. They say, well, then who can be saved? And I always ask people who ask me that question, it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than a rich person to get in the kingdom of heaven. And I said, what's the answer that Jesus gave to the disciples who can be saved? 99% of the time, they don't know the next line, which tells you the whole thing. He says, with man it is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Now this poor rich man who Jesus invited to follow him, it's interesting, when he says, he looks upon him and loves him and says, follow me. That's the same thing that he says to the other apostles. We could have had a 13th apostle, in effect. The sad thing about this man is that he really reversed the pearl of great price.
Right.
He gave up something of much greater value for little baubles.
How has your book been received?
I have to say, now of course I'm going to say this and I'll have to correct it, but I haven't seen a negative review of it. I think there have been some critiques of it. Some people, one person said that, well, this is great, but, it's not deep enough. He needs to be more technical. Of course, the the thing I was not trying to do was be technical. I was trying to present basically a series of homilies and meditations on this. I think it's a basic connection. There are very few books that have made these connections, and only a few articles in the commentary world that make the connections between the economic dimensions of the Gospels and the parables themselves. So I have to say, it seems like it's been received well. The people I've talked to have been nice, but they always say bad things behind your back.
I'm sure that's not the case. Well,
my main concern in writing the book was that, and I think I've succeeded because it's said several times throughout the book, I didn't want anybody to pick up the book and think that this was an argument for Jesus being an Austrian economist. That's not what the thesis of this book is.
right. I think it's a very interesting read, and I'm very happy it's going to be in Spanish.
Yes.
So it'll reach an even larger audience. And so, is there anything you would like to add before we end the conversation?
Well, what I'd like to say is that Christ places before us a great challenge, and we have to recognize the value of that challenge, or we won't be able to discern its real worth. I think that rich man young man who was being called by Jesus didn't discern the real value of that. The merchant who buys the pearl of great price had to understand pearls.
Right.
He had to know something about the value of a pearl in order to, first of all, identify it and then to surrender everything he has. And if there's any one message that I would leave people is find that pearl in your life.
Thank you, Father Sirico. Thank you for granting us this interview.
Thank you.